Today we're going to be talking about things that you didn't know were made by the Chinese. Paper money. While the rest of the world was too immersed in the sound of clinking coins to symbolize wealth, China was already going band for band. Scratch that, they were going M for M with papers. When the people from Tang Dynasty decided they'd had enough of the jingling workout every time they went to buy something, they came up with this totally new way to buy stuff that didn't involve hauling around bags of bronze or iron. They basically said, screw it, let's make paper cash. By the 7th century, trade was popping off in China. People were moving goods up and down the Silk Road, bringing all kinds of in and out of the empire. The problem? Coins weighed a freaking ton, especially if you were trying to buy anything more expensive than a noodle bowl. So the government started issuing these little notes as a receipt, letting people drop off their heavy cash at local offices and just carry around paper instead. This idea blew up so hard that by the time the Song Dynasty rolled around a couple of centuries later, they made it official and turned paper money into legal currency. But paper money wasn't anything fancy. This was before wallets, banks, or credit cards. They just wrote a few numbers on a piece of paper and called it a day. It was more like an IOU from the government than the dollar bills we've got now, but still, it worked. People trusted these notes because, well, what were their options? CrossFit? The emperor said it was money, so it was money. Imagine if the government just handed you a piece of paper today and told you it was worth $100. Wait, they do that now. Dang it! The Chinese government controlled the whole process because if paper was money back then, every Jackie Chan would just be making one at home. Only specific shops, usually approved by the government, could give out this paper money. So, if you tried to hand over some DIY currency, you'd probably be thrown into jail. It took until Marco Polo's trip to China in the 13th century for anyone in the West to even hear about this stuff. Marco was like, "You guys are not going to believe this." He saw how everyone in China was all about their paper cash and basically went home to Europe screaming about it. Took Europe a few hundred more years to catch up though. Typical. The funny part is, the Chinese eventually got tired of their own invention. By the time the Ming Dynasty came around, inflation hit hard. Basically, the government printed so much paper money that it became worthless. You could have a sack full of notes, and it wouldn't even buy you a single dumpling. So they had to ditch the whole idea for a while and go back to metal coins. Toilet paper. Scrubby people. This was also invented by the Chinese. In the 6th century, during the Sui Dynasty in China, people began using paper for ass wiping after using the toilet. Before this, many of them cleaned with, things. Yeah, things. These things. Paper was a revolutionary product for them since it was invented almost 1,000 years ago before this. At first, it was mainly used for writing important documents or wrapping valuable items. As time passed, paper became more available and affordable. People started to find new uses for it. In the 6th century, a scholar named Yan Zhitui wrote about using paper for toilet purposes. He mentioned that he wouldn't use paper that had writing on it to clean himself, showing that people were indeed using plain paper to wipe after doing their business. And then the 8th century came, and there was this Arab dude called Abi Zaid al-Sirafi. He saw that the Chinese were wiping and wrote in his blog, "Guys, what's up? Day 30 of my world tour. Currently in China. They don't use bidets over here. They have toilet papers. Pretty disgusting if you ask me. Smearing it all over your ass and calling it clean." As the centuries went on, the production of toilet paper in China increased. In the 14th century, during the Ming Dynasty, there are records of large-scale production. In 1393, it was recorded that the imperial court in Nanjing ordered 720,000 sheets of toilet paper for the use of the imperial family and the palace. These sheets were quite large, measuring about 2 feet by 3 feet. In addition, 15,000 sheets of special soft perfumed toilet paper were made specifically for the emperor's use. This shows that toilet paper was not only widely used, but also had variations in quality. While the Chinese were advancing in their use of toilet paper, people in other parts of the world were still using other methods. In medieval Europe, for example, people often used hay, straw, moss, or even their own hands to clean themselves after using the toilet. The idea of using paper for toilet purposes began to spread slowly beyond China. In the 16th century, the invention of the printing press made paper more common in Europe. However, paper was still relatively expensive, and people were not quick to use it for cleaning themselves. It took several more centuries before toilet paper became a product available in the Western world. Kites. In ancient China, kites were important tools used for many things. People used them for big tasks, like in wars and solving hard problems. Can you believe they used kites to plan battles or measure how wide a river is? It's like using a paper airplane to do your math homework. Well, maybe not exactly, but you get the idea. Kites were a big part of life back then, and they did much more than just look pretty in the sky. Back then, armies didn't have the gadgets we have today. No phones, radios, or walk-the-talk phones. Oh, it's apparently called walkie-talkie, but whatever. They needed a way to talk over long distances on the battlefield, so they used kites. They made kites with different shapes, colors, and designs. Each one meant something special. A red kite might mean, attack now, and a blue one could mean, stay where you are. A kite with a dragon design might signal, enemy ahead. It was like sending a message, but in the sky. Soldiers had to watch the skies to see what the kites were telling them. Soldiers had to learn what each kite meant, or else, things would go south. Measuring things was also hard without tools. If an army came to a big river, they needed to know how wide it was. They couldn't just swim across to check, and they didn't have bridges ready. So they flew a kite over the river to the other side. The kite string went from one bank to the other. Then they pulled back the kite and measured the string. Now they knew how wide the river was. Pretty exhausting though, but it worked. Hansen used a kite in a clever way. He wanted to attack a city, but the walls were too strong to break, so he decided to dig a tunnel under the walls. But he needed to know how long to make the tunnel. If the tunnel was too short, they wouldn't reach inside the city. If it was too long, they would waste time and energy. He flew a kite over the walls, and the string showed him the distance. His soldiers dug the tunnel just right, and they took over the city. Kites were also used to scare the enemy. Soldiers made kites that looked like scary creatures, like dragons or ghosts. At night, they flew these kites over the enemy camp. The wind made spooky sounds as it went through the kites. The enemy heard the noises and saw strange shapes in the sky. They got scared, thinking ghosts or spirits were coming for them. Toothbrush. Well, at least the bristled ones. Not that I know any other kinds of toothbrush. In the Tang dynasty of China, people made a new tool for cleaning teeth called the bristle toothbrush. They used stiff hairs from the necks of hogs. Using pig hairs to brush teeth was normal then. They needed a way to keep their teeth clean, and this was how they did it. They made handles from bone or bamboo. The handle was cut to the right size to fit in the hand. At one end, they made tiny holes. They put the hog bristles into these holes. They had to make sure the bristles didn't fall out. It was like making a little brush by hand. Getting the hog bristles wasn't easy. Pigs don't just give away their hairs. People had to collect the stiff hairs from the pigs' necks. Maybe they had to sneak up on the pigs. It must have been a tough job, and probably not the best smelling one. The hog bristles were stiff and sharp. They could scrub the teeth and remove food bits, but they might have hurt the gums. People back then might have thought, if it doesn't hurt, it's not working. They didn't have soft toothbrushes like we do now. Before the bristle toothbrush, people used other things to clean their teeth. They chewed on sticks or used cloth. The bristle toothbrush was better. It could reach between teeth. It was like getting an upgrade. It was the new gadget of their time. Making the toothbrush took time and effort. They didn't have factories or machines. Everything was made by hand. They had to find the right materials and put it all together. It wasn't easy, but they did it. They were resourceful with what they had. You might think that hog bristles now would be something people in the Sentinelese Island would use, but the Tangs didn't have plastic or nylon. They used what they had. You can also use what you have to click the subscribe button. Nobody will blame you for it. Mechanical clock. During the Song dynasty, there was a man named Su Song. He was born in 1020 and lived until 1101. He was very smart and knew a lot about many things. In 1092, he built a big clock tower in the city of Kaifeng. This clock tower was special because it was powered by water and was about 12 meters high. The clock tower showed how the sun, moon, and stars moved. On top of the tower, there was a model of the sky called an armillary sphere. It had rings that showed how the sun and stars moved across the sky. There was also a globe that showed where the stars were. People could look at the tower and see where the stars were at any time. The clock tower worked by using water. Water flowed down and turned a big wheel. This wheel made other wheels and gears inside the clock move. This was one of the first mechanical clocks ever made. Before this, people used sundials or simple water clocks that were not very good at keeping time. Susong's big clock was much better. I would have loved to see this big clock of his, or maybe I'm just zesty. Inside his massive clock, there was a special part called an escapement. This helped the clock keep time by controlling how the gears moved. It made sure the clock didn't run too fast or too slow. Susong was one of the first people to use an escapement in a clock. This was important because it made clocks more accurate. Without it, the clock would be useless. Another cool thing about the clock was that it used a chain drive. The chain helped move things inside the clock. This was before anyone else used chains and machines. The chain drive helped the clock work smoothly. Susong wrote a book about his clock tower. It was called New Design for an Armillary Sphere and a Celestial Globe. In the book, he drew pictures of the clock and explained how it worked. He wanted to share his ideas so others could learn. Maybe he hoped other people would build their own clock towers. In 1127, the city was attacked by enemies called the Jurchen. They came from the north and wanted to take over. They ransacked the town, and with it came the fall of his erected clock. Card games. During the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907 AD, China was a land of innovation and cultural growth. Paper, which had been invented earlier, became more widely used, not just for writing but also for new forms of entertainment. People were getting tired of the same old games, so they started looking for something fresh. This is when playing cards came into the picture. The earliest known reference to playing cards comes from the 9th century. A writer named Su A mentioned in his book, Collection of Miscellanea at Duyang, that Emperor Yizong of Tang's daughter, Princess Tongchang, played a leaf game in 868 AD. These leaf games were the first playing cards. They were thin pieces of paper, small enough to hold in one hand. People began using them for games that were different from traditional board games. At first, the cards were simple. They had numbers and basic symbols on them. The games played with these cards were straightforward, but they offered a new kind of fun that people hadn't experienced before. Families and friends would gather to play, enjoying this new pastime that was easy to learn and play anywhere. As the popularity of these cards grew, so did their complexity. Artists started to decorate the cards with intricate designs. They drew images of gods, mythical creatures, and scenes from popular stories. This made the cards more interesting to look at and added a new layer to the games. The artwork on the cards became a form of expression, showcasing the artist's skills. People began to collect different decks, each with unique designs. Some cards featured characters from famous novels or plays. Others had symbols representing different social classes or professions. The variety in designs made collecting cards a hobby in itself. It wasn't just about playing games anymore. It was also about owning beautiful pieces of art. In addition to being used for games, playing cards became tools for education and storytelling. Some cards had poems or moral lessons written on them. Parents used these cards to teach their children while they played. The cards became a way to pass down knowledge and culture from one generation to the next. But as with many things, some people took it too far. They started gambling more than they could afford, causing trouble for themselves and their families. Some people got so obsessed with the games that they lost their homes and belongings. It was a damn shame to see lives ruined over a deck of cards. The government noticed these problems and tried to step in. Laws were made to regulate gambling and prevent people from losing everything. Officials warned about the dangers of excessive gambling, but not everyone listened. Despite the risks, card games remained popular because they were just too much fun to give up. During festivals and public celebrations, card games became a common sight. People would gather in public places to play, sometimes forming large groups. The games added to the festive atmosphere and provided entertainment for both players and onlookers. As the Tang Dynasty came to an end, the use of playing cards continued to flourish. The following Song Dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1279 AD, saw even more developments. The invention of woodblock printing made it possible to produce cards more efficiently. This meant that more people could afford them, and the games became even more widespread. Parachute. The idea of the parachute was touched upon by Chinese inventors long before it became known elsewhere. In ancient China, people experimented with devices to slow down falls. They used materials like bamboo and silk to create structures that could catch the air. During the Han Dynasty, there were records of acrobats performing stunts using umbrellas or similar contraptions. They would jump from high places, using these devices to ease their fall. It showed they knew a thing or two about air resistance. They observed that spreading out surfaces could slow down movement through the air. In the centuries that followed, inventors kept tinkering with designs. They looked at how birds spread their wings and how leaves floated to the ground. Using this knowledge, they made improvements to their own gear. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, more advanced concepts emerged. People started using large, cloth-like materials to create parachute-like devices. These weren't perfect, but they were a heck of a step forward. They tested these devices by jumping from trees or platforms. It was risky, but they were determined to find ways to make it work. Chinese inventors also explored the use of kites, like I said earlier. They noticed that kites could stay in the air due to wind and design. This led them to think about how similar principles could apply to slowing a fall. They experimented with different shapes and sizes, adjusting their designs based on what did or didn't work. They weren't afraid to fail and try again. There are tales of a man named Wan Hu, who supposedly tried to reach the stars using rockets and a chair. Materials played a big role in these developments. Silk, being strong and lightweight, was an ideal choice. It allowed for large surfaces that could catch the air without adding too much weight. Bamboo provided sturdy frames. The combination of these materials made their experiments more successful. They made do with what they had and made it work. The understanding of air resistance and gravity wasn't formalized yet, but they had practical knowledge. They knew that wider surfaces fell slower. This common-sense approach guided their designs. Acupuncture. You know, that process where you have to look like this guy and a pufferfish combined to be relaxed. Chinese thing, really. People began using acupuncture over 2,500 years ago. They believed it could treat various illnesses and restore health. In the early days, during the Stone Age, people used sharp stones and bones for treatment. These were called beyond stones. They used them to pierce the skin and drain abscesses. This was a basic form of acupuncture. As time went on, they started using metal needles made of bronze and iron. This allowed for more precise treatments. Ancient Chinese medicine is based on the concept of qi. Qi is the vital life force that flows through the body. It moves along pathways called meridians. There are 12 main meridians, each linked to an organ system. If qi flows smoothly, a person stays healthy. If the flow is blocked or unbalanced, sickness can occur. Acupuncture aims to restore the balance of qi by unblocking the meridians. Around 100 BC, a medical text called the Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, was compiled. This text lays out the theories behind Chinese medicine. It describes the meridians, acupoints, and methods of diagnosis and treatment. The book has two parts, the Su Wen and the Ling Shu. The Ling Shu focuses on acupuncture and details the techniques and functions of acupuncture points. During the Han Dynasty, acupuncture became more organized. Doctors began to classify diseases and their treatments. They also started using pulse diagnosis to determine the state of qi in the body. In the following centuries, acupuncture continued to develop. In the Tang Dynasty, the government established medical schools. They trained doctors in acupuncture and herbal medicine. Bronze acupuncture statues were created during this time. These statues had holes at the acupoints and were used for teaching. Students would practice needling the points. If they hit the right spot, water inside the statue would leak out. When Western medicine began to influence China, some scholars viewed traditional medicine as outdated. In 1822, the Qing government removed acupuncture from the Imperial Medical Institute. They considered it unfit for the elite. Practitioners were pushed to the margins, but acupuncture persisted among the common people. Rural communities continued to rely on traditional medicine. But then again, we still have it today. Seismograph. In 132 AD, Zhang Heng, a Chinese scientist and inventor, created the first seismograph to detect earthquakes. Earthquakes were a big problem in China, causing damage and loss of life. People had no way to know when or where they would happen, especially if they occurred far away. Zhang Heng wanted to find a way to detect these earthquakes so help could be sent quickly to affected areas. Zhang Heng was skilled in many fields like astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. He thought hard about how to make a device that could sense the direction of an earthquake. He designed a large bronze vessel shaped like a barrel. Around its outside, he placed 8 dragons, each facing a different direction: north, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, west, and northwest. Each dragon held a bronze ball in its mouth. Below each dragon was a bronze toad with its mouth open, ready to catch the ball. Inside the vessel, Zhang Heng set up a pendulum and a system of levers. When the ground shook from an earthquake, even one far away, the pendulum would move. This movement would trigger the mechanism, causing the dragon facing the direction of the earthquake to drop its ball into the toad's mouth below. When a ball dropped, it made a loud sound, alerting people that an earthquake had occurred. The direction of the dragon that dropped the ball showed where the earthquake came from. This was a clever way to know not just that an earthquake happened, but also where it was located. One day, the seismograph released a ball from the dragon facing west. People in the city didn't feel any shaking and thought the device was broken. Some probably muttered, "This contraption is busted," but Zhang Heng trusted his invention. A few days later, messengers arrived from the west, reporting that an earthquake had indeed struck in that direction. This proved that the seismograph worked and could detect earthquakes that people couldn't feel. Zhang Heng's seismograph was important because it was the first tool to detect earthquakes and show their direction. It helped officials know when and where earthquakes occurred so they could send help if needed. This was crucial in a time when news traveled slowly by messengers on foot or horseback. Over the years, others built on his idea to make better seismographs. His work laid the foundation for modern seismology, the study of earthquakes. Today, scientists use electronic sensors and computers to detect and record seismic activity. While these modern tools are more advanced, the basic principle remains the same: detecting vibrations from the earth to understand earthquakes. Crossbows. During the Warring States period, around the 5th century BC, Chinese craftsmen created this new type of bow. It was different from regular bows because it had a horizontal limb assembly mounted on a stock. This design allowed a shooter to release bolts with more force than a normal bow. The early crossbows had a simple trigger mechanism. This allowed soldiers to hold the drawn bow without much effort. They could aim more carefully and shoot with greater accuracy. The trigger was a key part of the crossbow's power. Chinese armies began to use crossbows widely. They became a common sight on the battlefield. The crossbow bolts could pierce armor and shields. This made them deadly against enemy troops. The weapon could also shoot over long distances. Soldiers could attack from afar, keeping themselves safer. As time went on, the Chinese improved the crossbow. They developed the repeating crossbow, which could fire multiple bolts quickly. This was achieved by adding a magazine to hold extra bolts. The shooter could operate a lever to draw the string and load a new bolt in one motion. This increased the rate of fire, making the crossbow even more dangerous. The crossbow changed military tactics in China. Armies began to use formations that took advantage of the weapon's power. Crossbowmen could weaken enemy forces before close combat began. They were often placed behind shield walls or on higher ground. This gave them a better position to rain bolts down on their foes. Crossbow technology did not stay in China. It spread to other parts of Asia and eventually to Europe. Other cultures saw the effectiveness of the crossbow and adopted it. In Europe, the crossbow became a key weapon during the Middle Ages. It was used in many battles and sieges. Negatives. These negatives first showed up in a book called The 9 Chapters on the Mathematical Art. This book was put together during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC to 200 AD. It had many math problems that people used in daily life, like measuring fields and calculating taxes. Chinese mathematicians used counting rods to do calculations. These rods were small sticks made of bamboo or bone. They placed them on a counting board to represent numbers. Red rods stood for positive numbers, and black rods stood for negative numbers. This system let them work with both positive and negative numbers easily. They needed negative numbers to deal with debts. In trade and business, people often owed money. Debts were like negative amounts, and assets were positive amounts. By using negative numbers, they could show debts in their calculations. This made it possible to solve problems involving money owed and money earned. For example, if someone wanted to buy 7 jars of opium for 1 coin each jar, but only had 5 coins, they would have -2 coins and crippling addiction. Quick maths. Using counting rods, they showed this as 2 black rods, meaning -2. This way, they could keep track of debts and assets accurately. It was a practical method that helped them in everyday transactions. In the 9 chapters, there are problems that involve adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. They did not see negative numbers as strange. Instead, they used them just like positive numbers. This was different from other places, where people did not accept negative numbers for a long time. They developed rules for working with negative numbers. These rules are still taught today in math classes. In other parts of the world, like Europe, negative numbers were not accepted until much later. European mathematicians thought negative numbers did not make sense. They called them absurd or fictitious. It was not until the 17th century that negative numbers became widely used in Europe. They also used negative numbers in solving equations. For instance, they could set up equations with unknowns and solve them even when the numbers were negative. This allowed them to solve more complex problems than those who did not use negative numbers. So now, here's your random fact because I don't know how to end the video again. The Yangtze River is Asia's longest river. It's also the 3rd longest in the world. See y'all.